Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, in this first segment, we are excited to bring back Kevin Gosztola, independent reporter at The Dissenter, also author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. And we are delighted to have Kevin on the program today to celebrate the fact that Julian Assange, believe it or not, is a free man. That doesn't mean that there weren't costs and consequences. That doesn't mean that the future of journalism is preserved. We have to be ever vigilant. But Kevin Gosztola has been on this case since its inception. Kevin has been our go-to expert on this. And of course, we're not alone in this. The late, great Daniel Ellsberg said of Kevin and his work that he is a rare journalist who understands the abominable threat that the case against Assange poses to press freedom. Ellsberg said he relied on Kevin's indispensable reporting not only to stay informed about Assange, but to follow developments in the wider war on whistleblowers. And Kevin Gosztola, welcome back to the Project Censored Show for a rare occasion when the two of us can have something good to say about the Julian Assange case, and that's that it's come to an end, but not without costs and consequences, not without him apparently pleading guilty to journalism. Kevin Gosztola, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. And let me take a moment to say what I've said on multiple shows, which is it's unfortunate that Daniel Ellsberg did not live for this moment so he could share in the cheer. There's so many people who have contacted Julian Assange. And I do want to say up top that the mood is jubilant on the part of the Assange camp, that this is a victory for them. And in fact, Jeremy Corbyn, who we know as a leading politician in the UK, and had contacted Julian Assange and congratulated him on the victory. And Julian Assange said, no, it's everyone's victory. And we all share in this. Stella Assange, his lawyers, everyone, they've made clear that this was a global movement that created space for plea deal negotiations.
Which is absolutely important, very important to remember. And of course, Kevin, you can give us more of a background too, to remind folks of this long and twisted, torturous case in many ways. But also, you know, let's talk about the right now. Let's talk about what also just happened. And I know that off air, you and I were talking. We had a clip that we want to share of folks of Julian Assange. Basically saying that he's in a way disagreeing, of course, with the interpretation, but also simultaneously noting that he is in fact guilty of journalism. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, and as the author of the book, Guilty of Journalism, mm-hmm. I would like to tell you, I had no idea he would sit in a U.S. court one day and say, when he was asked to describe his quote unquote crime, that he would say basically he was guilty of journalism. And so let's play the clip right here.
Right. So let's play the clip of Assange in the courtroom. Here we go.
At this time, I'm asking you to explain to me, what is it that you did that will constitute the crime charged?
Working as a journalist, I encouraged my source to provide information that was said to be classified in order to publish that information. I believe that the First Amendment protected that activity, but I accept that, as written, it's a violation of the Espionage Act statute.
So you had certain belief, but you understand what the law actually says as well.
I believe the First Amendment and the Espionage Act are in contradiction with each other, but I accept that that it would be difficult to win such a case given all the circumstances.
And so there's the voice of Julian Assange in court, essentially noting that he does not see, he sees as incongruous or incongruent the Espionage Act and the First Amendment, but was not prepared to move forward to argue the case given the circumstances. Kevin Gosztola.
No, exactly. That's something that beyond Julian Assange's freedom, we all have to grapple with. Anybody who cares about freedom of expression, the standards that the United States tries to set globally, what is being said there, accepted by a U.S. judge and supported by the U.S. prosecutor who's in the room, is that the Espionage Act and the First Amendment are basically incompatible. I mean, essentially, under the Espionage Act, there are no First Amendment rights. So once you violate it, you do not get the claim that the First Amendment protects you from prosecution. And so the First Amendment says one thing about what's allowed in the publication of news, and then the Espionage Act says another. And there's no settled law, and we live in this kind of actually lawless state at this point until some court actually settles this matter. The sad part is the only way to settle this matter is to have a case where a journalist is punished for journalism. It won't be Julian Assange, but there will be a case in the future because the Justice Department will try this again.
Well, and we've talked about this for years, unfortunately, because the case had gone on for so long, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in this segment. But Kevin Gosztola, the punishment was in the process. I mean, and that's even come out now. Assange was agreed to plead guilty to one count. Is that right? Under the Espionage Act, which was basically 5 years time served when he got to Australia. So essentially, he's going to be convicted. He's convicted of this felony, right?
Yeah.
It'll be on the record, but he is also a free person after many, many years of being tortured, being imprisoned, being surveilled, harassed, and even the subject of a potential CIA assassination campaign. Kevin Gosztola.
Yeah, though he was welcomed back to his home in Australia as a hero. He got on the phone with the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who has been fighting for his release, lobbying the Biden White House to end this case. It's important for me to note here about the way this plea deal happened that Julian Assange was released on bail from Belmarsh prison, which was known as, and still is known as, Britain's Guantanamo, after enduring harsh confinement conditions in which his health and his physical and mental health deteriorated significantly. He hopped on a charter flight, and the Australian High Commissioner, it's the most senior diplomat in Australia, flew with him to, they had a layover in Bangkok, and then they flew onward to a U.S. territory. I kind of think it's a colony, but they went to North Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean, and they went into this small courtroom and had this proceeding where it all happened very fast, lightning fast. This typically does unfold over like 2 or 3 months. They did the guilty plea and the sentencing all in about an hour and a half. And then he went onward to Australia where he could rejoin his family finally. And you know, in this hearing, what we heard was that the U.S. could not identify a single victim of these leaks. Oftentimes, the government, and they did this in Chelsea Manning's case, I believe, they'll seek restitution for individuals who were harmed by the crime. They did not name a single person that Julian Assange had affected. That tells you that there are zero, and it confirms zero. And it's a message to the news media that they should stop talking about how WikiLeaks has blood on its hands and repeating U.S. propaganda, because even the U.S. government itself could not go before a judge and prove harm.
The establishment press in the U.S. they've had a real double standard. They've been very hypocritical about the Assange case, WikiLeaks case, with major newspapers both simultaneously using this information to win, Pulitzer Awards prizes, but then simultaneously throwing him under the bus or having a real tepid relationship with the support for his case. And you just mentioned that the US government has no case where they were talking about known victims of the leaks of the information. They basically exposed heinous war crimes committed by the United States, among many other things. But still, the press has a twisted relationship with Assange. You know, some still saying that he should still be punished more. I mean, can you comment on this bizarre, kind of state of affairs between the establishment press, the Fourth Estate in the United States, and their very problematic relationship with whistleblowers, leaks, and Assange in particular? Kevin Gosztola.
To me, the best way to illustrate the twisted relationship is how even today the New York Times will say and claim that Julian Assange was a source and not a partner in working on these documents that came to WikiLeaks from Chelsea Manning. And that was because they wanted to try and insulate themselves from being prosecuted by the US government, or else they wanted to act like they were better and different than Julian Assange. But it is a distinction without a difference. The US Justice Department does not see any difference between Julian Assange and a New York Times editor or reporter who works on previously classified documents from the US government and publishes them. So it's on them to recognize that this precedent is severe for the future of journalism, and it's going to be up to us to reckon with it. While Julian Assange is healing, we're going to have to reform the Espionage Act, get a public interest defense for journalists, or pass a reporter's shield law that could exist in this country to protect journalists from subpoenas that might offer some kind of protection from or deterrence from the Justice Department trying to have their way with media organizations. But I do think I appreciate the bittersweetness of this. On one hand, we can celebrate that this is a massive defeat, in my view, for the CIA, for the FBI, for the Justice Department's National Security Division, which I think would have been perfectly comfortable if through the punishment by process, Julian Assange wound up being pronounced dead at some point in Belmarsh prison. They didn't get that. Instead, he walked out free and boarded an airplane and came home to Australia. On the other hand, Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Freedom of the Press Foundation, various civil liberties organizations, all of us are looking at this going, what happens next? And that's really disturbing.
Well, what does happen next? I mean, let's talk a little bit about some of what's been going on here, and I'm speaking with you on Thursday, June 27. The program will air next week across the US. Kevin Gosztola. It's also, I believe I learned recently that the US was charging Assange for chartering the plane that took him back to Australia to the tune of £500,000.
So what it sounds like is they had the Australia government pay for the flight, and then the Australia government said, we'll get Julian Assange to pay us for the charter flight. I don't know why they're putting an ally in that position to begin with. I would like to just be an anti-imperialist for a moment and say the US arrested and charged Julian. They kept him in prison. They're the ones that lost confidence in their case. They no longer wanted to be as aggressive as they had been and bring him to the US for trial. They got tired. They didn't want to continue to put up with this fight because Julian Assange did not give up and was actually in a winning position because there was an appeal hearing coming where they were going to argue over the First Amendment and say that if Julian Assange came to the US for a trial, he would be prejudiced due to his nationality, since non-US citizens have no First Amendment rights. That was something the High Court of Justice was taking seriously. It brought the US government back to the negotiating table for a plea deal. And so they should be paying for the flight. They should be putting Julian Assange on the plane, bringing him to a US courtroom, and then securing their guilty plea. But I'll tell you, in addition to that, one of the things that stunned me is just picking up on little details. I looked at the press release from the Justice Department that announced this plea deal with Julian Assange and how they had secured a guilty plea to the conspiracy charge under the Espionage Act. And I was stunned because there are no statements from any high-ranking official celebrating the outcome. Nothing from Attorney General Merrick Garland, nothing from the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, nothing from anyone who worked on this case. And it's also like very sloppy and wordy. It's a closing argument, basically, like the kind that you would give before you get a verdict from the jury, and not a statement of victory. So even today, the announcement of the plea deal, they're still trying to persuade the world that their actions weren't corrupt.
Yeah, this was pretty amazing. Pretty amazing developments. Chief among them, of course, is that Julian Assange has been released from Belmarsh prison, pled guilty to one charge under the Espionage Act, but is a free person in now in Australia. Kevin Gosztola, it's an election year in the United States. Trump is the one that helped really ramp up charges under the Espionage Act of Assange. Biden, of course, and the Democrats, going back to Biden, Obama, they prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other presidents combined. The Biden administration has not really been friendly to Assange or the Assange case. And look, as much as you and I might like to think that the Assange case is so important that it's a burning issue for many Americans, the reality is that it really wasn't. Many Americans don't even recall much of who he was, and most of what Americans knew seemed to be based on the propaganda and misinformation that kept floating around from our own press, distorting the case, which is, again, why your book is really, it's just fundamental to understanding the case. If anybody wants to understand the backstory of what happened in this case and what we were up against in terms of press freedoms, not just the case against Assange, but the press itself, your book is a primer on this. Your book is a one-stop shop, The Guilty of Journalism, Political Case Against Julian Assange. But Kevin, how much of this do you think was that this is an election year? I'm leaning towards not much of it, although it may be some crumbs for some of the First Amendment people on some side, on some fence somewhere regarding election 2024. But it seems like that there were other issues that maybe led the government to play this hand. Kevin Gosztola.
I don't think that the upcoming election mattered too much.
Right.
I could see officials in the Biden White House or the wider administration being uncomfortable with the idea of putting a journalist on trial or a publisher on trial. However, Biden called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist when he was vice president.
Yes.
And Donald Trump, his only use for WikiLeaks was when he could reference emails from her campaign, from Hillary Clinton's campaign, and attack his opponent. But he doesn't have anything from WikiLeaks to attack Joe Biden this round. He didn't in 2020, and he had no interest in seeing it through. He apparently told Judge Andrew Napolitano that he was going to pardon Edward Snowden and Julian Assange in the final days of his presidency before Joe Biden was inaugurated. That would have been January 2021. And then he let people like GOP Senator Marco Rubio and Mitch McConnell get to him and frighten the bejesus out of him that they were going to vote for impeachment. So then he would have to deal with that. And both Assange and Snowden did not get their pardons. So I don't believe electoral politics had anything to do with this. It is the appeal hearing. And it's also the pressure of a close ally, Australia, that ultimately gets this done. Kevin Rudd is a former prime minister for Australia, and he traveled to Washington, D.C. not long ago. This is according to Jen Robinson, who was Julian Assange's Australia attorney. And he was there aggressively demanding that the Biden White House end this case.
So that's extraordinary. The Australian government ended up playing a pretty key role. I know that there was criticism over the years of various parties not seeming to do enough, but a lot of this stuff too, Kevin Gosztola, happens behind closed doors, right? And we don't always get to see or hear the things that are happening. One thing that we do know is that the many committed folks, journalists, people who are First Amendment enthusiasts in reality, not just abstractly, people that support press freedoms. I know we at Project Censored have been unwavering in our support for Assange, going all the way back to Chelsea Manning days, and you've been covering these issues since then. Kevin Gosztola, what do you think is next for these discussions around the Assange case? Obviously, there needs to be a lot of personal healing, and he needs time to be with family and reintegrate. He's suffered immensely over the last 5 years, just in Belmarsh, let alone prior to that. What can you say, do you think, moving forward here? What might we see coming in the next month or two over summer? And of course, our press freedom groups, really going to rally around this and maybe use some of this momentum. There are other journalists and other people and other publishers around the world, less high profile than Assange, that need help and support and need a bigger platform. So Kevin Gosztola, maybe your thoughts on things moving forward about what we might see out of this case. Positive news.
Absolutely. Very quickly here, looking ahead, part of the plea deal was the US government making a commitment, and they put this in writing, that there will be no charges brought against Julian Assange going forward for any publications before this plea deal. So that's gold. And it means he can't get in trouble for the Vault 7 materials from the CIA. And it means he also can't get in trouble for any of the campaign emails, the DNC or the Clinton campaign emails that were published, if they wanted to say that was a crime. So what I think people should be focused on is ensuring everyone knows about this history. I'm pleased to say that I wrote a book that will now be a history book. It's not something I need to go around waving and warning people of what's to come. It's the past. And so people will have to educate themselves on this history and then find a way to use it in a manner that can help prevent a future Assange case, a similar Assange type case, because we need Espionage Act reform. We need a reporter's shield law. And I'll just conclude here. I know I only have like a few seconds, but I just want to quickly roll call and thank the people who gave me a platform regularly to discuss this Assange case. Breakthrough News, Scott Horton's radio show, Status Quo with Jordan Cheriton, Project Censored. And these shows were spaces that I could turn to. There were a lot of progressive media shows that didn't invite me or welcome me, but these were shows that cared about Assange. Support independent media like these shows.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin Gosztola. That's very important to note, because it wasn't just the establishment press that had a bizarre, hypocritical stance on a lot of what was happening with Assange. There were even some press freedom groups, and there were even progressive outlets that just couldn't be bothered with Assange because they believed the misinformation, they believed the smear campaigns against him, and they wanted to distance themselves from it. But I think that the lot of us that supported the First Amendment, that supported press freedom, and supported Julian Assange, I think that we've been vindicated here by this recent outcome. And it came at a high cost and a high price. And I want people to know that when we sit here and celebrate the fact that Julian Assange has been freed from Belmarsh prison and is in Australia, been back in his home country, that came at a very steep price. And Kevin, you write about that in your book, Guilty of Journalism. You write about the many things that Assange endured. And again, without getting too listy, maybe you can remind, we have a couple minutes left here, maybe you can remind some of our listeners of exactly some of the kind of treatment that Assange really withstood. And then I wanted to end by reminding our listeners about a few really, really important cases and things that we know about because of Julian Assange. Kevin Gosztola.
Well, yeah. So Julian Assange was in some form of arbitrary detention for the last 14 years. He spent around nearly 7 years in the London embassy, Ecuador's London embassy. And then he was in Belmarsh prison for 5 years. And he was in solitary confinement conditions for like 23 hours a day. He's had sunlight deprivation, sensory deprivation, essentially. This has done incredible damage to Julian Assange. But then you look at some of the examples of what WikiLeaks brought to us, and it's I believe I'll just focus on one incredible example that people will understand right now as the United States protects the Israeli government from accountability. You find in the WikiLeaks cables examples of the Bush administration and the Obama administration interfering in European courts so that CIA agents and US soldiers are not prosecuted for war crimes. You find cover-ups, a blocking of investigations into the deaths of people who are journalists or individuals who were tortured. And so that's something we should take away, is that WikiLeaks was about accountability and justice. I don't know if WikiLeaks will be functioning again now that Julian Assange is free, if we'll be seeing more leaks on the war on Gaza, leaks on the war in Ukraine. I would love to see those. But whatever might happen, you know, there were these shows like yours that invited me to discuss this case. If I could quickly there's a couple I left out. So Lee Camp has had me on. I need to give credit. And yes. Katie Halper and some other people out there were good at inviting me on their shows. And I just want people who have listened to me give these updates to know other colleagues of ours that did care about giving space to this regularly. There's a lot of progressive media shows that did not follow this case or care what was happening to Julian Assange.
Yeah, and that's the part that is very unfortunate. But I think it's right to call attention to the sources, to the spaces that really were dedicated to this issue, including people at Mint Press News and Manar Adley and Alan McLeod and Loki, obviously to Consortium News, Jalaria, of course, your colleague John Kiriakou, and others. I mean, there's a long list of people that supported Assange, but to me, it's again, it was mystifying to see how many were afraid of the case or didn't get the case. Well, it's good for us, Kevin, and it's good for Julian Assange that he is now a free person, and the U.S. government has basically, I mean, look, let's just say it: the U.S. government didn't come out looking great in this case, and I think they took a defeat. They really didn't win this case. I mean, I know that a lot of damage is done. But it is also true, Kevin Gosztola, that the U.S. government didn't win this case.
We've got an internet connection hiccup, but I'll let it work itself out.
Oh, so it is true that the U.S. government is conceding defeat in this case. They did not win this case.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I don't think there's any winners.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that Julian Assange wins because he still has his life. You know, he's not dead. But beyond that, there are no winners. And so perhaps that's why they were able to reach a plea deal, because in the end, you know, they both had a shared interest of finding a way out. You had basically Julian Assange is going to fight for press freedom. United States government is going to fight for the national security agencies that want revenge. And in the end, they basically looked and said, well, for either of us to get those things, it's going to probably be 4 or 5 years from now before we reach that point. So let's just settle. Let's just accept that, you know, it was almost like you get to the end of a match and they go, all right, good game. Let's just be done here. And then they go their separate ways.
Yeah, except they're playing with people's lives. They're playing with major press freedom principles, things that we really, really live by. Kevin Gosztola, it's always wonderful to have you on the program for your updates and your great reporting. And in this case, it was actually great to have you on to celebrate the freedom of Julian Assange. And I know that I know of few other folks that were as invested in this case as you. And so I know that you're really you're delighted. I know that he is now free. And of course, we'll still be following the case and following what's going on with Assange. The chilling effect, Kevin Gosztola, is still out there, right? The chilling effect against people who are leakers and whistleblowers. Even though Assange has now walked free, he paid a heavy price. And I think that people will think that people will not be ignorant to that, Kevin Gosztola.
Yeah, this chilling effect is real, and people should look at examples that are going to come here in the future of the US government trying to define who is and is not a journalist. I maintain that it does matter. Julian Assange is a journalist. I open my book, those are the first words. Julian Assange is a journalist. I hear from the civil liberties crowd that it doesn't matter because the First Amendment just protects acts of journalism. But to me, conceding that the US government has some kind of a point, that he is not a journalist, that he exists in some gray area, opened us up to this case in the first place, because we were then pulled into this area where they could claim that their prosecution under the Espionage Act somehow doesn't threaten the First Amendment because Julian Assange is not a journalist. And so if we had just all agreed that he was a journalist from the beginning, we would have been in a stronger position to fight for Julian Assange. Anyways, we're here, and I'm very pleased and proud that this comes to an end, that the saga of 14 years, it ends a chapter in my life, but we're talking about Julian Assange, who is the important person here, and it brings an important chapter of his life to an end. And now, as the judge said to him, who I was actually astounded, wished him a happy birthday. You don't get that from U.S. judges usually, but she also said, I hope peace is restored for you. Yeah. And so that's the great thing here, that peace has been restored for Julian Assange, and he can have whatever life he would like after this. It begins with recovery. It begins with taking care of his own health, and then we'll see what comes from that. I look forward to whatever Julian Assange still has to offer this world.
That's the voice of Kevin Gosztola at thedissenter.org, author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Kevin Gosztola, always wonderful to have you on, and a pleasure to celebrate Julian Assange's freedom with you today. Thanks for all of your important work.